everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are. We really are very grateful for you joining us for this interesting conversation. We think around supply chain issues in the pharmaceutical sector and elsewhere. And this is increasingly becoming an important issue across the continent, just given the COVID disruption and the issues that have occurred across the continent, and the fact that during the COVID, during the height of the COVID disruption, even basic pharmaceuticals or vaccines were not available. And so I wanted to share a slide. I wanted to share just to remind us, that basically what's happening across the continent is that several countries are now involved in manufacturing. And when we looked, 6 months ago, this were sort of the potential sort of manufacturing sites across the continent. Probably, this was an issue. This is focused on vaccines because that was the conversation. But this really sort of represents, what's happening and the various, and this is an underestimate. Like, for example, this does not have Kenya, that now has the Moderna conversations and lots of other folks. So increasingly, the continents, across the continent, there has been a decision to focus on manufacturing, on various pharmaceutical or medical consumables. And so today we'll be hearing from different views and perspectives across this. So thank you so much for joining. So I'm really delighted to welcome Mr. Olaf Schmidt from the IFC. He's the manager responsible for health, education, tourism, and property development. But Olaf, we're focusing on health, your health responsibilities today. And so Olaf has kindly agreed to make the opening remarks for this discussion session. Olaf, please, can you say a couple of words about yourself and the IFC? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ekbe. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and to discuss this very important subject, which is close to our hearts, and I'm sure many on the line too, how we try to make a big impact in Africa. And so in that sense, I'm really delighted, Ekbe, that I can kick this open and then hopefully we have an interesting discussion as we go along. So about myself, just very quickly, I'm, as Ekbe says, overseeing what we do in these different sectors. You will hear me later. I think there are links, very important links between the sectors when it comes to special economic zones. For instance, I believe strongly in pharma clusters and other things. So hopefully we can discuss that. And I'm currently based in Johannesburg. We are active across the continent. I will share a few slides in a few minutes also. But actually, let me try to pull up the slide so we don't have to struggle as we go along. Let me see if you can see that. So would have been too easy, right? If I just can see the slide I wanted. I don't know, Ekbe, if you Jamie, also have the slide.
Okay, we do have the slides. Jamie, Sean, can you pull up Olaf's slides, please?
That would be lovely. Because somehow when I try to share screen, I don't see the slide. So it's always the same, right? When you're so if the slides can be shared on your side, that would be fantastic, Ekbe. So I will get going in the meantime, and just, since this is on efficiency and governance of pharma supply chains, there are a few thoughts I really want to share up front, which is many of the numbers we have seen, but I do think it's important that we kind of, when we have these discussions, pause for a minute and reflect upon these. Oh, thank you. These are indeed the slides. I will let you know when we can move to the first slide. I have a bit of a preamble. So, for instance, there are two facts I want to share to get started. One is, right, Africa represents 26% of global disease, while having 16% of the global population. And of course, this is even more underlined, the gap, by the fact that 2% of the world health spending happen on the continent. When we look at pharma a bit more specifically there, we do have basically the context that when you look at the continent, we have 400 roughly drug manufacturers, while when you look at China and India, that's 5,000 and 10,000 respectively. And that, of course, has a lot of impacts. It drives up the costs, it limits the availability, and there are also all kinds of other side effects, right? I mean, as we all know who are involved in the sector, it could be fraudulent products that are circulating, and many people without access, and therefore having impact on the health across the continent. So in a way, this kind of has been becoming even more clear, I would say, with the pandemic, because the health gap has been even more exposed on the continent, right? I mean, be it the PPE production, be it pharma products that were important, vaccines, etc. And then, of course, I mean, the one number that many of us have heard is, right, 1% of global vaccine is only produced here on the continent. But at the same time, we feel that this is the time where you might have a real opportunity to turn around things. And that's what gets us quite excited actually at IFC, and we are trying to work on that, and I will share a few examples. But when you look just at the vaccine, for instance, right, the African Union kind of put out there the objective to get to 60% local manufacturing on the continent over time, which is of course very, very ambitious, but it means we need to think through the whole value chain. And that is where we need to have better local manufacturing, better local distribution across the continent, and leverage what is at hand. What is different today than compared to even a decade ago is, of course, the whole technology, the digitalization that we have here, and that can allow for improved communication, much speedier research, and help to really leverage those technologies to leapfrog. I mean, be it telemedicine, patient monitoring, or at-home test kits. I mean, a long list could be added to that. So therefore, we feel Africa is at a juncture, and we need to put a few things within this supply chain in motion. And of course, the health insurance will be a very important one, and I'm sure that will be discussed later, so that more people have access to healthcare and medicines, right? And that will again help with growing the market locally and improving the quality. And we think also the whole, and we have the Africa map here in front of us, the whole trade expansion, especially with the Africa continental trade, free trade area, will offer a huge opportunity to make a difference and create one large pharma market. When you look at India, for instance, I mean, they have invested decades with long-term capital and have been able to grow their industry. In the early 90s was around $1 billion to over $45 billion today. So very, very significant. Now, when we look at here, kind of at what we do at IFC and the World Bank Group to try to make a difference, and that's where hopefully we can have a lot of discussion today in this webinar, is, I mean, we have significantly invested in that space. We are in just to give you a bit of a sense, as you know, we support private sector companies in emerging markets. We have done over 6 billion globally and 1 billion in Africa, but I'm actually hopeful that we will do much, much more. And we can do anything from equity to debt and in between. So our main kind of contribution in this discussion is on the financing side. But at the same time, because we are part of the World Bank, there is lots of exchange that is needed with regulators. And that is a discussion that we often have to try to advance and be part of. There are two other things I want to highlight. I mean, we are in this context of pharma supply chains. increasingly leveraging what we call upstream engagements, where we think about how can we create markets that were not there before. And I will give specific examples in a minute with regards to that. I think the whole standard setting is another area which is very important in this context. And the title, right, has also to do with governance of the supply chain. So how do you instill the right standards into this value chain? And that's something that we are actively normally working on with our clients. I mean, the whole ESG side is there, but also the health quality side. We have, for instance, an advisory tool which looks at health quality assessment. And that allows, I mean, particular health service provider, but also labs and diagnostic centers to look at how can you get to the next level. And I think that is very important as we think about efficiency and transparency of that value chain. With regards to the map that you have in front of us, I mean, we are active in most countries, of course, the larger ones on the continent, but also the smaller ones. And for us, kind of looking for the impact that we look is really the critical piece. So therefore, I mean, we do sometimes very small transactions in smaller countries, because of course, there locally, it still can make a huge difference. If we can just go to the next slide, I think the next one we can skip, whoever has a control on the slides. Let's see what the next slide would look at.
Okay. Sean, can you go to the next slide?
Yeah, Trent.
It's basically, I'm looking for the slide where you have the three boxes, not this one, the next one, sorry. Yeah, this one, perfect. So traditionally, we really have been, I would say, no, the previous slide, please, with the three boxes. So traditionally, we have been really looking and supporting the health services providers. Yeah, so you have seen us, particularly in the hospital sector, and trying to help create platforms, etc. But more recent years, we have engaged more in the pharma value chain and also medical equipment side. And I think that's where really this discussion here is. And the question is, how can we support as a community? And many of you come into this kind of sector from a different angle, but how can we move really the needle? That we, you know, instead of 400 kind of manufacturers, we have a few thousand over the next few years. So we really support kind of, let's say, local manufacturers, and we have done that quite a bit. You know, for instance, in East Africa with companies like Abacus or Pyramid. But I think there again, what would be really interesting is when one thinks about value chain creation, to say, how can you build a cluster? And I think a few countries are making progress, and I'm sure that we will hear today quite a bit about it, that you say, how can you create, for instance, in Kenya, a special economic zone that within that zone has a real cluster that tries to be competitive for the region on pharma production. And I think that is really something where we need to have the different parties coming together and kind of building that out. With regards to API and vaccine production, I mean, both are very important. And I mean, we have supported last year a very large scale transaction with Aspen, which of course is well established here in South Africa and active across the continent and outside of Africa, to help with a vaccine response, but also with COVID kind of drug kind of product response. And of course, that can make a big difference given that there's a lot of expertise there and a network. But at the same time, and that is what I said earlier with the upstream engagements, is how can you think about building out a new ecosystem? So Egbe referred earlier to, right, the Moderna discussion in Kenya. We are, for instance, also quite actively involved in Senegal and Rwanda, where you can try to bring basically the vaccine, let's say, knowledge from outside, but how do you create the ecosystem around it? Because there are many, many companies that need to supply towards this drug manufacturing. And that will really allow, in the end of the day, create the value in the country, create the jobs we are looking for, and create the less high level of dependence. So I think that to me is really the crux of where we need to kind of team up and try to develop that industry. API is a very similar discussion. I mean, the next pandemic will come and we will dry out, as we have seen this time with APIs, because global